yeah. Thank you, Matan, for singing with me. Anyone else? Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here. We're very excited to hear today from Mickey Bergman. This is your second time at IKAR. A few years ago, Rabbi David Kasher interviewed Mickey Bergman because I was away, and I'm thrilled that we were able to bring you back. And as I said during services today, it feels like especially in this moment, and especially today, it feels really important that we're able to hear from you. So a very brief background. Mickey Bergman is the vice president and the executive director of the Richardson Center for Global Engagement. He has pioneered in the field of fringe diplomacy, and been nominated for the Peace Prize. He is for the Peace Prize. Which Peace Prize? Wow. He's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. You might want to include that on your bio.
You were in LA. It's like the Golden
Globes.
This was Mickey's second nomination and 0 wins.
He has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, friends. He is founder and president of the Solel Strategic Group, along with publishing numerous articles, interviews, and opinion pieces for the New York Times. Mickey is a native of Tel Aviv and actually Ra'anana, where my brother lives, and a former combat officer in the IDF. He holds a master's degree in foreign service from Georgetown University. He's going to actually explains in the book the transformation from combat officer to peace builder and negotiator, and I'm really interested in you sharing that with our community. This new book is called In the Shadows, True Stories of High-Stakes Negotiations to Free Americans Captured Abroad. And in this book, Mickey tells the story of these very urgent negotiations and what it's like to climb inside the minds of some of the most notorious strongmen in the world in order to free the innocent. And I am so grateful to you and so moved by what you've done, and thank you for sharing this with us today. So the way that this will work is I'm going to invite Mickey to sit or stand here and share with us for just a brief introduction to your work, 12 or 15 minutes about your work. Then we're going to engage in conversation with this with the community. So Mickey, thank you so much. Welcome.
I'll start standing, I think. I don't know. But thank you so much, and it's great to be here. I was here, it was before the pandemic, so it feels like it was, a universe ago. And that we were focusing on North Korea. It was at the return of American student Otto Warmbier at the time, and the negotiations that we did there. But before I start, I just want to also acknowledge the fact, because I have some dear friends that came here, just to acknowledge them, so you guys see that it's not just talk, there's a face to it. Avin Hernandez over here just came back after being held captive in Venezuela. He came back in December in the last deal pulled up, and his father, Pedro, who was the champion that fought for him and brought him back. So it's always good to see. And no, I didn't pay him for that, but Avin was a public defender here in Los Angeles before he was taken in Venezuela. So what I wanted to do, I know that our hearts and our minds are a lot about Gaza now, and I want us to get there. But I want to kind of start with a little story, a different story, just to kind of get a sense of how the work is and what it feels like and looks like. And so when Danny Fenster, who's a Jewish journalist from Detroit, was taken in Myanmar, in Burma, I actually got the way I found out about it was through a Facebook chat from a friend of mine from Jewish summer camp here in Simi Valley, California, 20 years ago. And she's like, well, I have a friend that says that her cousin was just taken. Can you step in? And within a few hours, I was on the call with his brother, Brian, where he had to ask us to help. Why? We're not government. I don't work for the government. I work for a non-for-profit. We do this work on behalf of families at their request at absolutely no cost to them. We raise our funds elsewhere for that. So my mandate only comes when a family asks us to help. So that was a needed thing. And Myanmar, or Burma, just for background to set the level on this, is a country that went through a transition into democracy over the last decade, led by Aung San Suu Kyi. But then in 2021, in February 1st, the military conducted a coup. Removed her, put her in jail, house arrest. She's still in house arrest right now. And about 5 months after the coup, Danny Fenster, who was a reporter, a journalist in the country, tried to leave in order to go back to his parents' house in Detroit. And he was picked up basically by a passport officer who said, hey, there's a white guy trying to leave. Maybe I'll detain him to see, maybe my boss will like it. And that's how he ended up getting taken and detained. And then the word was that somebody was there, and they found out that he worked in a publication that since then has been become illegal after the coup. So that's the arrest reason and then trial. Okay. And as we step into something like that, we have to figure out how we get in and what is our theory of return, which is the script or the story that we tell ourselves of the shortest way a hostage or a political prisoner comes home. And so we try to do that. But here's an important point. My work on trying to free Danny Fenster started about 8 years before he ever was taken. Because you can't just jump into a crisis and build trust when there isn't any. You need to build it over time. And so we started, Governor Richardson and myself, about in 2012, 2013, we went to Myanmar, we met with Aung San Suu Kyi, we started working with her as a part leading up to the transition over there. That's the engagement part of it, it's the investment that we do in the relationships. And we did, I was there about 13 times before the whole thing came apart, including a crisis that we had with Aung San Suu Kyi in 2018 around the genocide against the Rohingya, which is a Muslim minority in the West, in the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh. And when we went there in 2018, sorry I go on these stories because it gives the context, it was the first time we went to meet with Aung San Suu Kyi about the crisis. Before that, it was all a build-up on democracy until she takes power. At that point, she was already in power. And we wanted to actually address the violence against the Rohingyas. And she was holding two Reuters journalists in prison for exposing stories about the genocide. One of them was a good friend of mine, Wallon. And so I went there. We had a strategy how we're going to get those two Reuters journalists out. My assumption, knowing Aung San Suu Kyi and working with her before, was that she was just trapped. That all she needed is to have the space for her to do the right thing and release those two journalists. And that she invited us to come over and to work on the Rohingya crisis just because she needed the space to do it against the military that was pushing her. I was wrong about my assumptions. Not because Aung San Suu Kyi is a bad person, she's not. She's complicated and complex like all of us. She has led her country and her people through struggles, and she committed herself to a peaceful resolution of conflicts between the different ethnic groups, but she has a blind spot. And that blind spot is the Muslim minority, the Rohingya. Now, I didn't see that. I had my own bias or thought of who I'm dealing with, and I didn't see that. So when we approached her on this, we thought the whole strategy was we just need to help her get the space to do the right thing. Didn't realize she didn't want to do it. So when we pushed her that way in front of other people, she dug in. And we had to escape and run out of Myanmar before she actually detains us. That was 2018. And I left the country, failed miserably because my friend and his colleague were still in prison, and feeling the fact, like, oh my God, I completely miscalculated this person and where she was standing. Now, fast forward 3 years later, Danny Fenster is taken. Now we're supposed to try and engage with the junta over there. And when you engage with a military government like that, you don't do it, oh, we want to come over because you're holding this political prisoner and we want to, like that. No, for them, he's not a political prisoner. He's a guy that is, is being tried for something that some infraction. So we had to come up with the story. And the story there was around, we're going to come in because we've had years of engagement with them, and we're going to talk about COVID. This is the middle of the pandemic, or towards the end of the pandemic, but for them, not so much the end. Talk about humanitarian aid, talk about all these things, and then knew that we're going to try and push for his release. The State Department, our own government, did not want us to go. Again, not because they're bad people, and not because they didn't want him released. Just want to be very clear about that. They didn't want us to go because they were worried, oh my God, I have friends coming over river. I'm sorry. We spent some time actually in Myanmar together as well, in one of those engagement trips I just told you about. The State Department didn't want us to go because they were afraid that if we go and we meet with the general, the head of the military government, and ask for Danny Fenster, he in return will ask for something from the US government that they were not really willing to give. That's why they didn't want us to go. But that's not how we work. We don't represent the US government. We don't try to pretend that we're going to pay certain prices. And we knew we had something with them that we might not have otherwise. So we got an invitation to go. The invitation came at the end of August, so 3 months after he was detained. But the State Department for 2 months held us back until we basically said, look, we're going, because it makes no sense to just keep him behind. And then Wendy Sherman, who was the deputy secretary, convinced us. He said, look, we'll be positive about your trip as long as you go and you completely de-link your trip with Danny Fenster. In other words, she asked us not to raise Danny Fenster while we were there and just talk about COVID and humanitarian aid. I don't work for them. Neither did Governor Richardson. We work for the families. At that point, I had to go and figure out how do I get a mandate from the family to actually still do it, knowing that the State Department is telling the family that this is not a good idea. And when the government tells you that something is not a good idea, and your family of loved ones, and Pedro can attest to that, it's very scary because the government is telling you not to do something, and the weight of the life of your loved one is on your shoulders, and you don't know what to do with it. So I picked up the phone, I spoke to Brian, Danny's brother, and I said, hey, finally we're going in 2 days. He says, that's great. And I said, but I need you to know, the State Department asked us not to raise your brother's case when we were there. And there was a little silence. And he said, well, I guess if the government says that we shouldn't do it, I guess they know what they're talking about. And I was not there to try and argue against it because that was going to be a losing proposition for me. I just let it linger a little bit, and then I said, we'll do what the State Department asks us to do, but Brian, if we have an opportunity, if we feel we can get him, we're not going to leave him behind, right? And he just laughed. He said, oh, please, no, if you have an opportunity, don't leave him behind. Click, I had my mandate. This is the gray zone in how we work in order to create those things, because it's really hard to have that space. And now I had to prepare, because I was carrying a failure 3 years before, and I was not going to fail again. So I obsessed over the general himself, the head of the military government in Myanmar. I watched his speeches. I watched interviews with him. I tried to get into his brain, but not in terms of the interests, but in terms of his personality. What drives him? What moves him? And you know what I found? You think a military leader, big, just did a coup, removed Aung San Suu Kyi, a Nobel Peace Prize winner. His voice is very soft. He has no charisma whatsoever. He's an introvert. Not what you would expect from a military leader that just conducted such a bold coup. And I think That's something. And so we figured out, and when we stepped into that visit, we said we're going to, one thing, learn our lessons from before. Because his personality is such, we're not going to raise the issue of the prisoner, of Danny, in front of anybody else, because that will make him defensive, and that will not work for us. And we knew we only had one shot. We had one meeting with him. And so we figured out that we're going to do what we need to do. We're going to come, talk about COVID, talk about all these things. And then the governor is going to tell him, hey, you and I, can we have 5 minutes, just one-on-one, just the two of us? And I gave the governor the talking points. I've written them. We always do that. I write them so he can leave them behind by mistake, but he sees, but they're written in such way. And the first one was for him to look at the leader when they were one-on-one together and say, over my career, I met with a lot of leaders. I know they tell you you're supposed to be bombastic and big and strong, all these things. I see you. You're a quiet kind of leader. That quiet leadership is extremely powerful. Don't let people take it away from you. And the idea behind it was twofold. One is to make him know that he actually invested in him. He watched him, he looks at him, he sees him, he's assessing him. And number two is taking something that must have been an insecurity for him and say, no, this is a plus. And I was not in that room because they had to be one-on-one, but the meeting that was supposed to be a 5-minute pull-aside ended up being 45 minutes. And the governor stepped out of it and told me that the moment he said that to him, the general took his glasses off. And he just went into a long conversation about family and about how his kids are mad at him because he never wanted to be the leader of the country, and that his wife is mad at him. Very personal on all of these things. So the governor felt like, yeah, we created an emotional attachment here. And the second point was, hey, I'm going to get criticized for coming here and seeing you. Because I'm legitimizing you, because you're responsible to... I'm a politician. I have thick skin. Let them criticize me. I'm here because I love the people of Myanmar and I want to help. But if you want to help me with the critics, there is this young kid here that if you give him to me, it will shut them all up. And the leader asked him at that point, he's like, this Danny Fenster guy, is he a big deal in the US? And the governor looked at him and was like, well, his release will be a big story, but I don't want you to do it for that. I want you to do it for me. And the leader looked at him and he says, you know what? I'm going to give you Danny Fenster. I'm going to give him to you. I'm going to do it here, but it will take me a couple of weeks. Will you come to see me again? Which, of course, the governor said, of course, we'll come to see you again. And he says, but nobody can know about it. So we were leaving, flying back. The reason why the leader needed the extra time is because he needed to conclude Danny's trial, which was ongoing for about 6 months at that point. And he concluded very quickly while we were flying back and sentenced him for 11 years. Now you think, wait a minute, that's counterintuitive. No. The bigger the sentence, the more grandiose the gesture of the release by the leader is. Now we knew it. Nobody else did. So by the time we landed back in the US, we were crushed by human rights activists, by politicians. Even the State Department called his family to tell him that we absolutely screwed their son over. Okay? Within 2 days, I get a text from the chief of staff of the leader to let us know that his very special package is ready. Can we be in Myanmar in 4 days? Now, this is in the middle of the pandemic. Like, arranging all of this is, there's no commercial flights. And another little thing came into this. Like, would the governor bring his wife so they can go and meet and do a double date? But here's the thing with it. That's when we knew how deeply we were successful in that strategy. And it was not, by the way, it was not fake. Like, it has to be genuine in it. Of course, we said that the First Lady is not going to come on this one, maybe next time, but we had a really, really quick time, 2 days basically until takeoff to figure out all the logistics of it. There was no plane that will take us. I found out a Lebanese private jet that was the only jet that was willing to take us over there from Qatar to Naypyidaw, where the capital, where we could do it. But of course, I realized I don't have Danny's passport. And when I need to get him on a plane, I need a passport. I don't even have his full name as it appears on the passport. And I can't ask his family because they don't know that we're going back to get him. Because if I actually call them, they might be so upset with me because of his sentences that they will take me off the case and I won't have a mandate. And I can't ask my own government because they don't even know that we're going. So I asked the junta. And they gave me his passport very quickly. Now, it served a double whammy because then I knew that they're serious. They're going to actually, because you never assume that it's going to happen until somebody is home. But if they're sending me his passport, then yeah, that's a given. So one crisis averted. Second crisis, we're in the middle of a pandemic. I have no idea if he's vaccinated. I had to put him, after the private jet into Doha, I had to put him on a commercial flight to New York. I can't do it without a vaccination. I can't do that. And I can't ask the US Embassy in Doha to help. So I figured out what we're going to do is we're going to rely on our relationship with the Qataris. That once we clear the airspace, which is about 6 hours flight, I will call them and say, I need an ambulance on the tarmac to do a PCR test very quickly so we can put him on a plane back to New York. The Qataris' response, by the way, to that, absolutely, by the way, can he do an Al Jazeera video, things? And I said, oh, on the tarmac, absolutely. So that was that. Last crisis, just to get the owner of the plane asks, the one that we chartered the plane from, asks the operator, oh, by the way, how is the manifesto? There's 4 people going in and 5 people coming out. And the operator, oh, no, it's a prisoner, they're getting out. So the owner is like, oh my God, I need a letter from the State Department that this is legit, because he's thinking we're going gun blazing with his plane to rescue somebody. Now, I can't get that letter from the State Department because, again, they don't know that we're going. So I sent him a signed affidavit that says that there's no guns involved, and that we will have release papers in English before we board the plane. And thank God he agreed to it. But there it was, a Lebanese plane with Lebanese crew flying a former Israeli special ops officer to save a Jewish journalist from an anti-Muslim country. But that was one of the stories that I tell through it. And the reason why I like that story, because it brings in together so many elements of what we do. The fact that we're not government, the fact that we have this relationship with the government. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's with friction with our own government. It's the fact that emotional intelligence plays such an important role in what we do. And that it's not only about national interests, it's about human beings and human connection. And we forget that typically in our diplomacy. And it's about the fact that negotiations are not always an exchange or a transaction. Negotiations are really the ability to influence somebody else's behavior in whatever means that you can do that, non-violent means, from my perspective. And so I wanted to start with that, and then I would love to have conversations because I haven't even touched Gaza, of course, not this yet. Should we take questions? Oh, you have one.
Okay. The whole book is like that, by the way. It's these stories are like nail biters. So you write, Mickey, that the world is more complicated than a simple dichotomy between good and evil. And you've just given us some hints of what you mean from this story. But I wonder if you can you just take us back to UCLA and the story that you share about how your whole understanding of the world essentially shifted in the early part of the book. Because I think that so much of what we're witnessing and experiencing right now that's making actual discourse really hard is that there is this sort of simple dichotomizing that's happening between good and evil, victim and villain. Each side thinks that they're the victim and the other's the villain. And actually they're both victims and they're both villains. And so I wonder if you can help us understand how you broke out of that false dichotomy, and how you then apply your new, more complex understanding of human beings to some of the worst actors in the world, who are the people who you're engaging with. Are you searching for their innate goodness, for their humanity? So walk us through that.
So I am a UCLA alum. That's where I did my undergrad. My wife is a USC alum. I'm a mixed marriage in LA terms. When I grew up, look, I grew up in Israel. I served for 6 years. Most of my service in the IDF was in South Lebanon. My job, my position, well, I was an artillery and Air Force coordinator with the special paratrooper unit, which means that I would go in with them into all these crazy special operations, and when something goes bad, I will be responsible to coordinate all the artillery and Air Force support fire in order to get us out. That was my profession. That's what I did. And by that, I've seen a lot of combat, got slightly injured myself in one of them, but I also spent time with the population in South Lebanon because we were embedded with them. And South Lebanon at the time was the population there. The IDF, when it came in there, the Israeli Defense Forces, when they took over, we supplied schools, infrastructure. The rest of Lebanon was in a civil war. The south was nice and quiet. So the South Lebanese army was our ally. We trained them, we supplied them, and we worked together. Over time, the war in the rest of Lebanon settled in. The war moved south, because at that point, it was first Palestinians, then Hezbollah trying to push Israel out. And the population started shifting with that. Not because they're bad, not because they're anti-Semitic, not because they hated us, because the one thing that they care about is the well-being of their own family and the future for their kids that will be better. And as long as South Lebanon was quiet relative to the rest of Lebanon, we were a blessing. As soon as South Lebanon became carnage and the rest of Lebanon seemed more or less quiet, we were a problem. And so I remember sitting with a family there, it's not a Shabbat dinner, but it's a weekend dinner, but it's the same. And I realized that the head of the village community is the guy that hosted us. One son serves at the South Lebanese army, and the other son serves in Hezbollah. And they're not different, not in their politics. No, they're just different in understanding, answering one question. Who is going to be responsible and in charge next year? Depending on your answer, that's where your loyalty will be. Again, not because you hate somebody, but and that was, to me, it was the first crack I had in understanding that that the perspectives matter a lot in this and what actually drives human beings. And then I came to the UCLA. By the way, the reason I came is because I met a girl in that summer camp at BCI. Yeah, I later became a program director there, but I met her the summer. I chased her here. It was a good chase. She's my wife for 22 years. Lee knows her very well. And at UCLA on the campus, like, you know, I wasn't 18. I was 24 because I started late because of 6 years in the military. But I was driven the same way. I was part of Hillel at UCLA as a part of the community that wanted to repair the world, Tikkun Olam. And only when I stepped into campus, I realized that the number one issue on social justice is Palestinian rights. And at first I was very defensive because I grew up in a certain narrative. And I started talking, and I started hearing, and I started learning that my sense of history is not necessarily their sense of history. And the truth is somewhere in the middle, and I spent a lot of time digging in, including some really painful conversation with my late father. Because I came back in a vacation, I said, hey, why didn't you tell me that 47 was different than what I'm hearing? Did you not know? And he said, no, we know. We figured out there'll be a time when you will find out, But when you're 18, we need you to go and fight. It's a part of the ethos. And that was a breaking point for me. So I came here and I went through this. I always, in Israel, I believed, it was always the same, from a Zionist perspective, that Palestinian statehood is a necessity for the sake of Israel. That was just politically where I was in Israel and the way I understood, but my motivation was from a very pure Zionistic perspective. And then I started meeting Palestinians. And I realized, just like the Lebanese, not all of them, but the ones that I met, it wasn't about kicking me to the sea and killing me. It is about their livelihood. It's about opportunity for them. And so I started going through that transition. So that's the first part of that. But not only did I go through this journey, I guess, for myself, I said, I guess reality is much more complex than I thought it was. But I also understood something about the power of narratives and the reason for narratives. Because I don't blame my father for raising me the way he did, not at all. But I do choose to raise my daughter differently because of that. Because I think I can trust her, even now she's 10, but she's been talking about it early on. Kids get it. I don't need to protect her by creating a false or a not accurate description of reality for her. So that's really about the first part. I started realizing, well, if that is true about what I do know, it must be true about the areas that I don't know. Other countries, other leaders. And I went through a journey of how I got into work, which just, I realized that, Middle East, Israel, Arab conflict is not everything that I'm going to do in my life, and the world is bigger. But I found very common things with other countries and with other leaders. And I think in Governor Richardson's funeral, President Clinton kind of described it. He said, like, the physical part of it is that you scratch the surface, and sometimes you need to scratch really, really deep until you find humanity. But I have to tell you, the North Koreans that I work with, even the Iranians, Revolutionary Guard Iranians that I work with in order to get Americans out of Iran, as individuals, nobody's evil. They don't wake up in the morning saying, let me see what evil I can do today. There's a narrative that explains what they do and why they do. And I realize I don't justify it, not at all. But I need to understand it in order to be able to understand how they will react to different things, and therefore what is possible to get from them, and in my case, the tangible things that I need. An extreme example of that is the North Koreans. A very extreme late example of that is the Russians. And working on Brittany Griner's release and Trevor Reed negotiations and all of that, I had no other choice but to step into, not into Putin's shoes, but into the narrative that his whole elite, his military and political elite, adopted as why they're doing what they're doing. Because they're not thinking, we're Russians, we're evil, we're going to do damage to the world. They believe in what they do is right. And I had to get into that. And now I'm going into this. Then at a very extreme level, October 7th for me. Because, sorry, tell me if I'm talking too much on this.
Please, you're here to talk.
Yeah, October 7th, like I'm assuming 100% of you, I woke up struck by the news. For me personally, there was a lot of PTSD coming for the first time in my life from this, because even though this was Gaza, not South Lebanon, the units that were, especially the reinforcement units that were standing are the units that I served with. Shaldag, Matkal, Sayeret Tzanchanim, all of these were people. They were different people. It's 20 years later, but I know the mentality. I know you go in and seeing the what was taking place that was traumatizing for me. But within 3 hours, I got a phone call, and that was from Leah Goldin. She's the mother of Hadar Goldin, an Israeli soldier that was killed in 2014, an hour inside the ceasefire, and his body is still being held by Hamas. And I know her because I worked with her for years trying to get her boy back home, his remains. And she called me and she says, Mickey, you know how for 10 years nobody listened to me? Well, I'm being bombarded by families now of people that are missing, and they suspect they might be in Gaza. Can I send them your way? And I said, of course. And the next 24 hours, I ended up with about 67 families asking us for help. Now, not all of them ended up being hostages. Unfortunately, a lot of them were killed on October 7th and found over time. But we had to go very quickly into the theory of return of this, which I can talk about in a second if you're interested, but I just want to stay on the emotional side of it. I flew to Israel in order to meet with a lot of them as we're trying to get the Israeli government to approve the first hostage deal. And I sat and I listened to stories of victims, of survivors. I don't know how many of you have seen the news from today, but Noah Argamani is back home safely today. It's for me, I mean, she and 3 other hostages are back safely in Israel after a military operation. My daughter's name is Noah. And just like Noah Argamani, she is also of brown skin color. My daughter is Guatemalan, Noah is partial, I don't even know what the mix that she has, but I always seen her, like for me, and I work with her family, I always seen her like, oh my God, this could have been my daughter. But her friends, she was taken from the music festival. I sat with her friends, for survivor friends, and the stories that I heard in that were stories, the type of behavior, the type of violence that was absolutely inhumane. I had to take it in and bury it inside because otherwise I wouldn't be able to be effective in my job. And I did that. And I did that with other stories, but that was one that really caught me. And I fast forward a little bit after the first deal was completed and then failed at the end. I flew back from Doha to DC because I knew there's nothing for me to do for about 10 days. 15 hours on that plane, all of that bubbled up. And it's not only that overwhelming sense, you're locked in a plane and the stories, they're very vivid, come back to mind. It's for me, somebody who believes that you need to talk to everybody. You need to understand, how do I engage with somebody who did that? And it was an existential crisis for me on that plane. And there's only 2 things that kept me attached to reality. The first one was the face of Aviva Siegel, who was released in that thing, and I worked very closely with her family. I just saw them 2 days before she came home, so that was like, there's a purpose in it. And the second one was little Abigail's face. And these are the 2 straws that kept me from completely losing it and saying, I can't do this. And I had to figure out, how do we find humanity in that, or in the people who justify it? And something else occurred to me. That was the time that we started hearing some numbers from Gaza. There was, 10,000 people have died, and a lot of them are women and children. And I remember my instinct. No way. They're lying. They're exaggerating. There's just no way that happened. And I had to force myself and force my brain to get in front of the computer and to watch the videos. And when you watch those videos, you don't know if it's 10,000, 8,000, 12,000, it doesn't matter. You understand, your brain gets retrained saying, like, this is happening. And I was trying to ask myself, why was my instinct the way it was? And I figured out, but because in the name of something that I believe in, the state of Israel, the right of Jews to have a homeland, a safe homeland, in the name of that, such devastation is occurring. My brain couldn't reconcile it. So the instinct, the shortcut, that's what our brains do in trauma. We find little shortcuts, and the easiest shortcut is, they're lying, they're exaggerating, it's not true. So you have to force yourself. And then I went to the next step of saying, wait a minute, is that what's happening within the movement in the United States of the pro-Palestinians for claiming that October 7th never happened? Because for them, in the name of something very pure, and by the way, I belong to that movement. I believe in Palestinian statehood, as I mentioned before. But in the name of something so just and pure as Palestinian rights to statehood, something as terrible as October 7th took place, their brains can't reconcile that. So every time there's a shred of a conspiratory evidence story that says, oh, it's exaggerated, it's fake, they grab to that. Their brains grab to that. And then it's like, how do we get beyond that? How we get to understand that this is what's happening to our brains? And how do we understand that the fact that the pain of October 7th to me matters much more because it's my people, but I don't need to negate their pain in order to talk about mine, and they certainly don't need to negate my pain in order to acknowledge theirs. I'll stop.
Thank God for you. I did this empathy exercise a couple weeks ago because I gave 2 sermons on 2 different vantage points on the protest movement on campus, and it was like you get punched from the right and then punched from the left. And I thought, instead of just saying they're all crazy, I want to put myself into their mindset and try to understand what they hear when they hear my sermon, why that feels like a betrayal. When I say, essentially, I can see that in this protest movement is a real sense of belonging and purpose and a heartache over war and devastation and loss of human life. And there's also a virulent threat of anti-Semitism there that is undermining the movement for Palestinian justice. And people say, that you are, you're a traitor to the cause. You don't understand what's actually going on there. And then I say the Jewish community is trying to counter this protest movement by engaging in its own form of denialism and by propping up its own set of fake news. And we've all, in some sense, adopted this kind of Trumpian worldview where we can pretend that the reality is only what we want it to be, despite the fact of all evidence to the contrary. And actually, it was really helpful. I mean, I tried to do it in solitude, just imagining what the person who calls me and says you are a traitor and you've betrayed your people is actually thinking, and what the person who calls me and says you have betrayed the left, you're not a human rights activist, you don't actually care about human life, what they're all actually thinking and processing. And I think they're both right. And I think I'm right too. And so I feel like this discourse that you're offering and what we try to lift up here at IKAR is so rarely heard in public spaces. And I think it's actually it's not only compassionate and reasonable, it's also right. And yet the dominant voices, the really loud voices, are not the voices that are examining our own denialism. They're only pointing to other people's denialism. And I heard Israeli officials who said there are no hungry people in Gaza. And then you look at images of children starving to death, and you're like, how do they not see what I see? Is it that, do they not, or are they choosing not to see? Can they not see what's, and vice versa? And the rape denialists, and like someone came to my office and said, like, it didn't happen. It did not happen. This was a justification for genocide. And I'm like, why must you deny the reality in order to criticize a war effort that you think is excessive and unjust? Why can't both things be true?
And first of all, your sermon today was extremely powerful, and in the back of my mind, I was thinking like, oh my God, if more people can just hear it, but listen to it, not from the defensive part of it, but listen to it, and there is a sense of feeling orphaned by both of your communities, both sides of it. And I certainly felt it and continue to feel it now, because even within this, you by now you get the content of what I do in the book, how I operate, how I think about these things. There are certain bookstores that wouldn't have me, even though they know the content, but it's because I'm Jewish and Israeli.
And it says IDF in your bio.
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
And I don't, and I try not to. Because some of them I know personally, and they feel embarrassed, and I said, look, I'm not going to throw egg on your face because I know this is the reality, but it's wrong. Yes. it's hard. There is I think that unless we start figuring out that we are all in trauma, and our brains are operating under a sense of trauma, we're not going to be able to start climbing out of it. And we can have discussions, and I've been having, again, because of my book, I've been having conversations in different communities. I had just 2 days ago, I was in New York, and was it South Shore community with the UJA. I had people come to me before my talk and explaining to me that, look, we all feel for the hostages, but the idea of Israel is bigger, and therefore, we should just realize that there are lower priority on this. And all I could think about, what you mean is that they're shaheeds. I didn't say that. But you get that in a sense. So I do talk with very different communities. I have this opportunity now. And even when I talk, I was just in Los Angeles last week for a little private event at my manager's house, and I was in conversation with Janea Future Khan, who founded Black Lives Matter Canada. It was a 2-hour conversation, but we started by looking at a very, very diverse audience and say, take a deep breath, recognize we're all traumatized on both sides here. Don't doubt the intention. Everybody in this room's intention. Nobody here wants to kill anybody. Nobody here wants to annihilate other people. We have our certain intentions. Based on that, can we have a conversation? And it was a very deep conversation. And people come back after these small conversations, and we had one, even though we didn't interact at the One America movement just last month. And they said, can we have that, bigger? I said, unfortunately, we can't.
Right.
Because it's such a high-touch issue that if this room was diverse, more diverse in terms of opinions and bigger, somebody would get triggered. And it will all get derailed. So my point is that you can't scale it, you need to proliferate. You need to keep it small, but you need to do plenty of them.
I agree. Amen. Okay, we have only about 10, 15 minutes left.
So I talk a lot.
No, this is great. We want to hear from you. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then because believe me, folks, that we could do this for hours, but I want to give the people who are here a chance to also ask a couple questions before we close. Can you just bring us up to speed right now on the captives who are held in Gaza and with the state of the negotiations? I suspect what the South Shore Federation people said to you reflects the perspective of many people in Israel's government right now, which is nobody wants there to be captives, but it is a low priority. They've clearly shown, I think, that the highest priority is what they're calling total victory. So how do you imagine that this might unfold, and can you give us your most hopeful version of what might unfold? Because I think that's what we'd like. What I'd like.
All right. I'll start with something, and then we can chat afterwards. The deal that has been talked about over the last couple of weeks, including it's the Netanyahu deal. I think the forum did it correctly because that's what he's whispering to Biden. It's not what he says publicly. That deal was available December 20th. How do I know? Because I delivered it to the Israelis. They didn't need me, but I heard it directly. I was in Doha. I was there at their request. I got it. It was there available. We just had more hostages alive at the time. And I know 2 cardinal truths about hostage negotiations, doing it for 18 years now. One, the deals never get better over time. They just don't. We make in our minds, we'll do military pressure, they just never get better. Number 2, time never helps the hostages. Horrible things can happen, not only in Gaza, but in other places, in Venezuela, which Evin spent time in as well. Like we had one of the prisoners that attempted suicide. There's fights, there's disease, there's a lot of things that can happen. So those 2 are cardinal truths that I know, and I've been yelling and screaming.
Tell us the 2 again.
Number 1, over time, deals never get better.
Deals don't get better.
And second, time never serves the hostages in terms of their survivability in this. And the difference is how much time are we wasting until we realize that that deal is the best that we could. We knew, in the case of Venezuela, we knew exactly what would bring Evin back home. Pedro knows his father because we talked about it, and his team there, Henry and Drew. Henry is his brother, and Drew is his friend that was championing his campaign. We knew that, and we had to convince the US government. And those extra months were wasted because the deal was exactly that deal. And so I'm saying that when I became really vocal about this, because I knew that the side that was holding it back was the Israeli side. The Prime Minister of Israel was holding it back. Again, not because he's evil, not because Hamas is good, just anything like that. But there was a deal on the table that they were willing to sign, and he was not. And when I became vocal and family started following me, I became a target for him. And so I went in January, I went through there was a campaign to delegitimize me, talking about my relationship with the Qataris. Actually, I think I was named in one article as a Hamas agent that needs to be charged with sedition. That was fun. Most of the family, by the way, it impacted some of the families. Not all of them, but it impacted some of the families. Fast forward, that deal was on the table until yesterday still. But it's not like Israel was going to move on it. You know, when Biden made it public, he made it out of frustration of 3 rounds where he tried to do it, and then it was talked out of from the Israeli side. This time he went in order to corner it. When somebody wants negotiations to succeed, you talk publicly about what is in common and privately about the gaps. When you want negotiations to fail, you talk publicly about the gaps. Netanyahu has been talking publicly about the gaps, and there are gaps. The end of the war commitment is a real gap, but there is no gap on stage 1. And with constructive ambiguity, you can get into stage 1, you can get at least 33 of the hostages back home. Now, we're all living the moment here. There was a rescue mission today, a successful one, fantastic for these 4 hostages. And I'm, again, as I talked about, like, you know, they're emotional a lot. There's consequences for the others. Because the biggest fear for somebody who's holding a hostage is a successful military rescue. In other words, tomorrow night, when a dog barks, a hostage might get shot. And that's the one thing that I'm fighting against now. It's like, hey, okay, we have this euphoric moment, which I participate in part. So you guys will see the news. It's complicated. There's a lot of people that died in that process. One of the soldiers died, but a lot of Palestinians died in that process. It's complicated like everything else. But now is the time to actually stop it. Because those 4 that were released today, it's great that they're home. They also could have been released in the same deal.
In December.
And ever since.
Oh my God.
So where do I think? I do think eventually we will get into a deal on this. Unfortunately, our estimates, and they're not based on any strong thing, is that we're looking at about 60 that are still alive out of the 120 that are held. But these are 60 that we can and should bring home. And to me, doing that in a way that will actually end the war, that's a twofer.
Wow. Do you know what I'm going to do? We're going to close with that. Forgive me, but I feel like the hour's getting late, and I want to give you a chance to catch your breath on Shabbos. Thank you. Thank you. I understand, Mickey.
I'll be happy to come back. I love this community. Every time I come, like, this is my first thing. I was like,
absolutely take you back. You were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So, but I really want to thank you for standing in the breach, physically and spiritually and emotionally, for really putting yourself on the line in order to save lives. And for us today, helping be a part of the culture shift, about the shift in mentality that we need in order to see a way to a future. I'm so deeply grateful to you, and thank you to all of you for staying here to be a part of this conversation. The book is called In the Shadows, True Stories of High-Stakes Negotiations to Free Americans Captured Abroad. Let's support Mickey. Please get the book and share it with your friends and gift it to people. Welcome home. And thank you to friends and family for your advocacy. Wow. Thank you, Mickey. Thank you.